Okay, the next and last speaker is Kenny Paterson from London University, and the title is up there.
Thank you very much. So thank you for sticking around for a talk on cryptography. I only recognise two cryptographers in the room, and my talk is going to be more or less addressed to them. So I'm sort of going to assume that you have some background knowledge of cryptography, like what a block cipher is or what AES is, for example. Is it reasonably safe to assume that kind of knowledge? Yes? You've all taken a course or given a course on cryptography at some point, right? No? Oh well, so you can sleep. So here's the agenda. I feel I ought to explain the title first, which was something rather obtuse about cryptographic theory for practice's sake. And then I'm going to give you what I think is a particularly interesting case study that illustrates the kinds of things that I'm interested in. I'm going to talk about a secure protocol called TLS, otherwise known as SSL, and a cousin of that protocol called DTLS. And hopefully that will spark some discussion points, maybe just with the cryptographers, but perhaps more widely. We'll see. Just to check, how many of you have heard of TLS? 1, 2, 3. How many of you have ever bought anything on the internet using your credit card? Yeah? Then you've used TLS. So you may not know about TLS, but you're all using it, and therefore I contend that you ought to know something about its security, and I'll hope to tell you something about the security. But let me start by explaining the title. So there was a very, very nice talk here by Silvio Micali a few weeks ago during the workshop on formal and computational cryptographic proofs. And midway through that wonderful talk, when he'd kind of established everything that he really wanted to say, he decided to start being a little bit more philosophical, and he had this beautiful seal in the middle of one of his slides, which basically said around the outside, "Theory for theory's sake," but in Latin. And my view is actually that in cryptography we already have plenty of theory for theory's sake. And what we want to start to do is to see what that theory is good for, what it can be applied to, and actually start to understand some of the barriers to its application or its adoption in real-world systems making use of cryptography. That's really where I'm coming from. I'm absolutely not saying that we shouldn't do more theory. I'm just saying we have lots of theory. Now let's see what we can do with it. So we've been developing it for the last 25 or 30 years. Maybe it's time to try to do something with it. Okay, so that's really trying to explain where the title is coming from. So let me say a little bit about TLS and DTLS then. So TLS stands for Transport Layer Security, and this is a standardized version of a protocol called SSL, which has been around for, I guess, about 20 years now. And what SSL or TLS are doing is providing security at the TCP layer. So here we're thinking about the TCP IP protocol stack. I'm thinking about networking, dirty, hands-on, real-world stuff, networks sending packets backwards and forwards. And what TLS does is it runs on top of TCP, so it uses TCP as a service and provides security. So it's extremely widely deployed. It's in every web browser, it's on every laptop, every iPad, every iPod, every everything is using SSL TLS. It's the de facto secure protocol of choice for the internet. Okay? And DTLS is basically the same thing as TLS, but instead of using TCP as its transport, it uses a protocol called UDP. UDP stands for User Datagram Protocol, and it's an unreliable communications protocol, unlike TCP, which provides reliability. And you might want to use UDP instead of TCP in environments where timeliness of data is very, very important. For example, voice over IP applications, where it's important that you get the data to the endpoint, whether or not it's actually correct. Okay? And you need to tweak TLS a little bit to get DTLS, but the tweaks are kind of low level, and they're important cryptographically, but they're not so interesting for us today. So here's a picture of the protocol architecture for the TLS and DTLS protocols. You have this communication layer here, which is your normal TCP or UDP communications. You have something called the TLS record protocol running on top of that, and I'm going to be talking a lot about the record protocol. And then running on top of the record protocol, making use of the record protocol, you have things like the handshake protocol, which is the part of TLS which is responsible for negotiating all of the cryptographic keys that are going to be used in the record protocol. A couple of other protocols, which I won't really mention. And then on the right-hand side, you have HTTP and other applications making use of TLS. So these are the application layer protocols that are now running over the secure protocol provided by the TLS or DTLS record protocol. Okay, so it's a sequence of protocols stacked one on top of the other, each making use of the other. And here we're really going to focus on this thing in the middle, the record protocol. These things upstairs are extremely interesting, particularly the handshake protocol. It's a very large, dirty, ugly protocol with hundreds of different options, very, very hard to analyze. And that's a whole other talk that I might give one day. But we're going to focus for now on this record protocol in the middle. And what the record protocol is doing is pretty basic. It's providing essentially a secure channel for communication. So it's going to encrypt our data and it's going to integrity protect our data so that we have a kind of a confidentiality service for our data, and we also have the ability to detect when an attacker has been modifying our data and trying to maybe change our credit card number from one number to another number, for example. And the way it does that is to use very standard cryptographic techniques. It uses a MAC, a message authentication code algorithm, to provide data origin authentication and integrity. It uses a symmetric encryption algorithm to provide a confidentiality service. And it uses sequence numbers, which are protected by this MAC algorithm, to prevent an attacker from taking an old message and replaying it as if it were a new message. This is an anti-replay service. As I said before, the keys are coming from the handshake protocol. And the real point I want to make is that this record protocol, which we'll look at in more detail in the next few slides, it's proven to be quite tricky to analyze. It's been recalcitrant in resisting security analysis over the years. And what I want to really sketch out is a little bit of the evolution of our understanding of the security of just this little record protocol that's part of TLS, and try to use that to illustrate some wider points about cryptography and cryptographic theory. So let's dig in a little bit deeper and look at actually what this record protocol is doing. And here's a picture. This is simplified somewhat, but the essential features are there. Let me get this. I've always wanted to use this big pointer, so let me actually use it. Fantastic. So here's our payload. This is something like HTTP traffic. Think of this as being your credit card number that's being transmitted over the network. Here's the sequence number, which is going to be used. Every payload that we send will have a fresh number here. So we'll have a counter starting at 0, 1, 2, and so on. Every payload will get a new number here. We put the payload and the sequence number and some other data, like the length field, for example, telling us how long this whole thing should be, into the MAC algorithm, where the key for the MAC algorithm comes from this handshake protocol, which has already taken place. This gives us our MAC tag, or our MAC value, which we put on the end of the payload. Then we do some padding of the payload and the MAC tag. Essentially, the padding is there because we're going to use a block cipher, and a block cipher needs the right number of bytes in our message to be encrypted before we can apply the block cipher. So we do our padding, then we pass it through the encryption algorithm to get our ciphertext. And we have our header out front. So this is a MAC, then encode, then encrypt construction, where the encoding step is putting together the payload and the MAC and any other padding that's needed to build something that goes into the encryption step. Okay, so it's kind of a modular construction, and the modularity is reflected here in the choices that you have for all the different algorithms. You can have a variety of standardized algorithms being used in the MAC step and the encryption step. And we're going to focus mostly on the CBC step here, the CBC encryption modes here. That's a particular way of turning a block cipher into an encryption scheme that can encrypt arbitrary amounts of data. There's also an option to use something called RC4128, which is a stream cipher, some kind of approximation to a one-time pad, for those of you who know some basic cryptography. And there's also a standardized mode called AES GCM, which doesn't look like this at all, and I'm not going to talk about it. It's standardized, but it's not actually widely supported yet in implementations. Okay, so that's the next level of detail about what this TLS protocol is using. And what we'd like to do is to understand the security of this system in terms of the security of its components, in particular the security of the MAC and the security of the encryption scheme. Okay, so that's what we do as cryptographers. We have a fairly complex system built out of components. We want to understand the overall security of the system in terms of the security of those little components. But let me dig just a little bit deeper and give you another layer of detail about the encryption algorithm that's used. So here's a slide that's a reminder for some, and maybe something new for others, of how you turn a block cipher into an algorithm doing encryption for general messages. So the idea is that we take our plaintext and we split it up into blocks numbered pi, and I'm just showing the encryption of one block here. Okay, there would be p1 up to pn for some n, representing your payload. And to encrypt the ith block, we XOR it with the previous ciphertext block and pass the result of that XOR through the actual encryption algorithm. This represents the block cipher to get the next ciphertext block. Okay, so we have lots of blocks, and it's called CBC, ciphertext block chaining mode, because we're somehow chaining the ciphertext in with the plaintext before we go through the encryption. And the decryption does the reverse. And this is a very well understood, heavily used way of turning a block cipher into an encryption scheme. It's used in pretty much every secure protocol that you will find being used on the internet today. We have to say something about how this whole process gets going. For the very first plaintext block, P1, we need some value down here, C0. And C0 is usually called the initialization vector, or the IV. And in early versions of SSL and TLS, this IV is actually got from the last ciphertext block of the previous message that was transmitted. So we're chaining together across the message boundaries as well. Okay? And then for the very, very first message that you send, it has to be some randomized value that comes from the key exchange protocol. In later versions, this was modified, and now you have an explicit random IV for each message that you send. There's a little bit of extra message that you have to send. You have to send this extra block at the beginning, and it should be randomly chosen. And what we know is that if you choose this IV in a random way, and if the block cipher is good, in some formal sense, then this mode of operation of the block cipher is also good. You get strong security out of it. So this is a good way to build an encryption mode. Okay. Any questions about this? No? I should say that decryption is the opposite of encryption, obviously. To decrypt the ith ciphertext block, we run this process in reverse, so we run it through the decryption algorithm for the block cipher, and then we XOR on the previous ciphertext block again, which undoes this operation, and we recover the ith plaintext block. Yeah? So it's just flipping things around. It has an interesting property, actually, this mode of encryption. Suppose I make some bit flips in this block here. I change some zeros to ones and ones to zeros. So I apply some XOR mask delta to the ciphertext block. The effect of that, if you look at it, is you end up with an unrelated or a related ciphertext going through the decryption algorithm here, which means this block will be completely randomized. But the delta that you apply here will come through this XOR and also end up being applied to the plaintext. So if you make a control change to this ciphertext block, you can make a control change to this plaintext block here. So this mode of operation of a block cipher doesn't have strong integrity properties. It has some manipulability, malleability, let's say. Of course, the effect of making a delta here is to completely mess up this block here, okay, because of the way the block cipher operates. Okay, let's just go a little bit further and now look at how the padding works in TLS. Because, well, my contention is that if you don't look at all of these low-level details when you're analyzing the security of such a system, maybe you're missing something important. And I'll illustrate that in a slide's time with showing you an attack, or at least hinting at how an attack might work. So what's the padding scheme? Well, here's what the standard for TLS says. It says that you should add at least 1 byte of padding. Okay, even if you're already on a boundary of the block cipher for your message, you should add an entire block of padding in that case. And if you need t bytes, then you should add t copies of the byte representation of t-1. So there's a particular way of padding out to get you up to the next block boundary. So you could add 00, a single byte saying essentially there were no bytes of padding, which is a little bit confusing. 2 bytes, 0101, and you can actually add up, you can go all the way up to 256 copies of the byte value FF, if you want to. So the padding that you add can extend over multiple blocks, if you want it to. Okay, so that's kind of a rather low-level detail, but it turns out to be crucial for security to understand how this padding is handled. Okay, so let me give you a summary of all of the security analysis that's been done of this MAC, then encode, then encrypt construction in TLS and DTLS since the very beginning. Okay, I think this is pretty much everything. So the very first results that were applicable to TLS really go back to the year 2000. Remember, SSL came in around 94, 95, so this is a few years later. This in some sense is theory catching up with practice. There's a very nice paper by Bellari and Namprempre from AsiaCrypt 2000, and they showed that if you just use a simple encoding where you concatenate the MAC together with the message, instead of adding padding as well, then you at least get these two properties. You get in CPA security plus integrity of plaintext. It doesn't matter exactly what this means, but it does mean that we get some kind of security guarantees out of this scheme. And this is under the assumption that the MAC is a secure MAC and that the block cipher acts as a pseudo-random permutation. Okay, so these are sort of standard properties of MACs and block ciphers. Kravchik, also in 2000, at Crypto 2000, proved something a little bit more specific. He proved that you get something called a secure channel for some definition of secure channel out of this MAC, then encode, then encrypt construction. But if you look carefully at his proof, it turns out that he has some hidden assumptions, which are not really made explicit in the paper. They're there, but they're not really called out as assumptions. One of the assumptions is that the tag, the MAC tag, must be exactly the same size as the block size of the block cipher. Okay, so that means, well, does that condition hold? Not always. For example, if you use HMAC SHA-1, you have a 20-byte MAC tag, whereas if you use AES in CBC mode, you have 16-byte blocks. So you have 16 and 20. You don't have that match that's required for his analysis. He also assumes that the tag exactly sits inside a block. In other words, the messages are already block aligned in his analysis. He also assumes random IVs. You can go a little bit further than his analysis, and you can prove as an easy extension of his results that you get, under the same conditions, you get in CPA plus integrity of ciphertexts. And if you're a cryptographer, you already know that you're there. This gives you authenticated encryption, which is a very nice, strong security guarantee to have for such a system. Okay, so that takes us up to the year 2000. Then, around 2002, I'm not exactly sure of the time, but it was noted by...
question.
Yeah, please do.
So this extension you're talking about,
yeah.
How does it add something to the Bellari and Namprempre paper?
The key difference is in this letter here, C instead of P.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. So what this means is that if you, in the BN results, you're guaranteed the attacker can't come up with a ciphertext that encrypts a new plaintext. In this extension, you're guaranteed the attacker can't come up with a new ciphertext that will be accepted as valid, whether or not it encrypts a repeat of an old plaintext. So it's a slightly stronger, well, quite a lot stronger security property. Good. So I was going to say about this attack here in red. This is attributed to Dye and Mueller, but I believe it actually goes back to an observation made by Phil Rogaway around 2002, 2003. Maybe, Phil, you can confirm or deny. Maybe you're not even aware of this, that your name is being used in these circles. Okay, good. So it was pointed out that if you use chained initialization vectors, you're actually in a state of sin. Remember, chained IVs are the ones where you don't choose a fresh random IV for every message that you send. You use the previous last block from the previous ciphertext. And it turns out that there's a very simple chosen plaintext attack against this MAC then encode and encrypt construction, in fact against CBC encryption, if you use chained initialization vectors. I would love to show you the attack. It's very simple, but there isn't really time in the half hour that I have. So what's interesting is that this was observed already in 2002, and you might wonder, well, what happened as a consequence of that? This was an attack against TLS, the protocol that we're all using for sending our credit card numbers. And the answer is precisely nothing, except that later versions of the standard that came out in 2006 and 2008 said, well, we'd better use random initialization vectors. But in the real world, everybody was still using TLS 1.0, which uses these chained IVs. Right up until last year, when Duong and Rizzo showed that they could actually make this attack work in practice. So you had an attack on paper due to Rogaway Dye-Muller, which then got turned into a real attack against real TLS implementations, but only in 2011. And at that point, everybody reacted. By everybody, I mean people implementing TLS in the real world. and they all updated their implementations to try to avoid this attack. Now, the most natural thing to do would be to make sure that you implemented TLS 1.1 and use random initialization vectors for every message that you send. That would be the obvious thing to do, and in fact that's supported by all of the theory, but that's not what happened either. In fact, they put in some attack-specific countermeasure that stopped this attack from working, rather than actually implementing TLS 1.1. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is this point that we have all this wonderful theory, but in the real world people do things differently, and they don't necessarily respond to the theory or the theoretical results that we've generated. Okay, so going forward, well, going back and then forward, there was a very nice pair of papers, one by Vodny in 2002 and then Canvel et al. In 2003, where they showed that padding was critical for security in TLS. In particular, they showed that if you could distinguish certain events during the decryption process, then you could break TLS. If you could distinguish a failure of the padding format, so if the padding format was wrong, from a failure of the MAC operation, then you could actually turn that into a plaintext recovery attack against TLS. Okay? So you had better make sure that when you implement TLS, that you can't tell the difference between these error events. You better have uniform error events happening in the system. This was kind of either based on distinct error messages or based on some kind of timing side channel. So all of the implementations were updated to avoid this attack. Almost all of the implementations, I should say, were updated to avoid this attack. And indeed, the later versions of the TLS standard tell you, as an implementer, how to avoid it, how to make sure that you have this uniform error processing. Okay, so next result in this chain of results was by Maurer and Tachman from CCS 10. And I have to admit that I don't fully understand this result because the formalism it uses is that of constructive cryptography, which is something that Maurer and Renner have invented, and it's a different way of thinking about security of systems, a little bit more like universal composability than about game-based security. So I have a hard time knowing exactly what this result means, but one thing to note is that it's not quite the complete story for TLS because the encoding step is required to be a function, okay? Meaning that for each possible message you send, there's exactly one padding pattern that you can add. But we already know that TLS allows you to use variable length padding. So in fact, there's up to 16 different padding patterns that you could add. TLS padding is not a function. It's a multi-valued function, if you like, a multifunction. So this result is actually getting closer to the real TLS, but it's not quite there yet. And what we showed, this P is me, with Riston, Part, and Shrimpton in 2011, is actually an attack against TLS, a distinguishing attack, when you analyze the real TLS padding scheme, when you can have variable length padding. But our attack has a condition on it, which basically says that the message size plus the tag size should be at most a block size minus 8 bits. In other words, you have to be able to fit the MAC plus a message byte into a block of the CBC mode encryption. And it turns out that none of the standardized modes allow you to do that. This condition is not satisfied in reality, except that they just standardized in a new RFC last year a way of using truncated MACs for TLS because it's more efficient that way. Okay, if you don't send all the bytes of the MAC, just send a few bytes of the MAC, and then this condition would be satisfied. So as soon as anybody implements that update to TLS, our attack would work and would allow you to break TLS in the sense of a distinguishing attack. But what we also proved in this paper is a positive result, which says that so long as you avoid this condition, in other words, as long as your MAC size plus your your message size plus your tag size is at least the block size, and as long as you have uniform error reporting, so that Bodney attack doesn't work, and as long as you use random initialization vectors, then you can achieve something called length hiding authenticated encryption, which is the sort of the new gold standard, I would like to claim, for what you should try to achieve with authenticated encryption. So this basically says that as long as you're not too daft, as long as you're a bit careful, you can get security for the TLS construction. So what's this result here? This is another attack. So we went back, this is Nadim Al-Fardan and I, went back and looked at implementations of DTLS instead of TLS to see what was going on there. And what we found really surprised us. We found that the OpenSSL implementation, which is really the leading implementation of TLS and DTLS, was still vulnerable in the DTLS component to the Vodny timing channel attack from 2003. So it had been re-implemented, and all the old mistakes had been made once more. So what we were able to do was actually a very efficient full plaintext recovery attack against DTLS in OpenSSL. That was published just a couple months ago at NDSS 2012. Okay, so why am I telling you all of this? Well, I hope that it illustrates some of the difficulties in developing cryptographic theory that applies to real-world protocols, and then making that theory count for something, making that theory applicable in the real world. And that's what I'm really interested in trying to do. So I've shown you that there are these quite extreme time lags between people finding an attack on paper, people then implementing the attack, and then finally vendors doing something about that and updating their code to avoid the attack or to move to the new protocol version. So the first example of that was the predictable IVs attack that I mentioned, the one that goes all the way back to 2002. But more recently, this attack that we found on short MAC tags is another example. So to all intents and purposes, we've been completely ignored by the vendor community with this attack. We found an attack just like the initial version of this predictable IVs attack from 2002. It's a distinguishing attack. It also doesn't have any known plaintext or chosen plaintext requirement. It's a ciphertext only attack. So it's really practical if somebody uses short tags. Okay? And yet, vendors are not interested. And I wonder why that is. Maybe it's just another theoretical attack. Maybe what you have to do is actually show them the plaintext before they take you seriously. In other words, you need a plaintext recovery attack to get the attention of implementers of these protocols. Another interesting thing that I found is that from a theoretical standpoint, if you find an attack, the vendors might not react in the way that you want them to react. They might find their own countermeasure, which actually isn't really the right countermeasure from a theory perspective. And this is perfectly illustrated by the response to the predictable IV attack again. Instead of going to TLS 1.1, which would avoid the problem, the vendors decided to do a low-level fix to TLS 1.0. I won't go into the details of it, but it's basically a nasty hack to the code to avoid the specific attack. What we've also found is that you have these old attacks that have been discovered, that have been released as vulnerability announcements, that the vendors have reacted to and updated their software, but then they're perfectly happy to repeat those mistakes again when they design a new protocol, and DTLS is the example of that. Fortunately, in this case, because we found, I think, a full plaintext recovery attack instead of just a distinguishing attack, the fix was very rapidly deployed. So OpenSSL updated their code back in January to prevent our attack from working, which was good news. A few other discussion points. You might wonder, well, the source of the problems here seems to be this MAC then encode then encrypt construction that TLS is using. And from the theoretical viewpoint, using something like encrypt then MAC is much more robust. You can instantly very easily prove that it provides authenticated encryption, for example. The point is that MAC then encode then encrypt is what TLS uses. So if you're interested in the security of this real protocol, that's what you have to analyze. You don't get to choose the protocol that you analyze. Right? I mean, you can choose not to do this line of work entirely, but if you're interested, that's what you have to do. So you might wonder, how did we get stuck with this MAC encode encrypt construction if it's so suboptimal? And why can't we change it? Why can't we get away from it and just redesign the protocol? I gave a talk like this in Zurich to Uli Maurer's group there, and the response to this whole talk was, well, why don't you just design a new protocol from scratch and prove that it's universally composable, and then everybody will adopt it. Unfortunately, the real world doesn't work that way, right? There's massive deployed code out there, and it's very, very difficult to get people to shift to a new way of doing things. Another point I wanted to draw out that's characteristic of this kind of work is that every detail matters. So the reason I showed you how the padding works, how the CBC mode encryption works, is that the attacks really depend heavily on those tiny byte-level features of the protocol. So if you really want to understand security from a theoretical standpoint or from a provable or a formal standpoint, you're going to have to build a model of the system that includes all of those features. Otherwise, you're not dealing with the real protocol. You're dealing with an idealization or an abstraction of it. You can still get useful results by looking at sort of high-level abstractions, but you should be aware that there's quite possibly an attack lurking just below the level of abstraction that you're working at. And this is very, very common, that you find you just look at the next level of detail, go to the byte level, or after the byte level, go to the timing level and start to time cryptographic operations. And you will find that your security falls apart entirely. So we attack implementations, but we prove the security of abstractions of implementations. And this is clearly something somewhat unsatisfactory, but we're a long, long way from solving this problem. The final point for me then is to say that TLS and DTLS were just one example of this. In fact, pretty much every secure protocol out there that you look at, I've listed some there, the same kind of story could be told. So there's clearly something going on here about the way that we think about secure protocols in theory and the way they get used in practice. And really what I'm about is trying to understand the interaction between these two different worlds and try to bring them somewhat closer together and get them talking to each other. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. If there are questions, I'll happily take them.
Okay, any questions, comments?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess all this talk here, in some sense, is not about cryptography. I think it's more about organizational structure, right? I mean, because there are some people sitting out there implementing protocol, deciding which protocols should be running and so forth, right? And I guess what your talk shows is that, well, either they are lazy and they don't read the cryptographic literature, don't pay attention, right? Because some of the things were already known that they were bad, right? Or they're stupid because they just don't understand it, or there's something third, and I don't know.
Or maybe the literature isn't accessible to them.
Right.
Because we write about polynomial time attackers and we write about goodness knows what, mumbo jumbo as far as a software engineer is concerned. And there's this sort of feeling that things get lost in translation in the process of taking a theory paper. The ideal model would be you'd have a theory paper that tells you what to do. Somebody writes a standard around that, which kind of implements the theory, and then people follow the standard and they write their software accordingly. Very often in the real world it happens in the opposite direction. So somebody writes some software with Netscape and SSL. This is how it happened back in 90 whenever. Netscape wrote SSL. Eventually IETF decided to standardize it in TLS. So they had to extract from the Netscape description what was going on. And then people came along after that and started to try to analyze it and understand what security it provided. So this kind of flow of information that we would like to happen for whatever reason isn't happening. And I take your point that maybe as cryptographers we should be keeping away from this stuff and leaving it, But I think we have a responsibility
That's
to.
not my point.
No, okay. Well, okay. Let me make my point then. I feel that we have a responsibility to say, well, as cryptographers, we should try to understand how people use our work or misuse our work, and perhaps help them understand it better, or perhaps design theory that results in abuse-resilient cryptography, for example, where no matter how many different dumb ways you find of implementing it, it will still provide you with some security guarantees. That's an interesting direction to try to take. It's probably impossible in general, but you can do specific things. Like it would be great, for example, if you had cryptography which didn't depend too much on randomness. I mean, Phil's worked on that with Tom Shrimpton, right? Where maybe if the randomness fails, then at least you still have some kind of deterministic security guarantees for your system. So I don't know if that answers your question, or maybe it's a discussion. Maybe it's a longer discussion about where does the realm of cryptography end and where does the realm of the real world begin. But for me, cryptography is the real world, and so we have to do this stuff.
Wouldn't there be a professional body that has the implementers and the theorists in?
I think that would be great, and currently that body doesn't really exist in any formal sense. There are, for example, ISO, International Standards Organization, committees that try to standardize cryptographic primitives, but they're not doing it at the level of entire protocols. You have the IETF, and they will take some input from theoreticians, from people like Hugo Kravchik or people like Phil Rogaway, but they tend to sort of kind of know their own mind about what they want to achieve, and so I think theory hasn't had the impact there that I would like it to have had. There are some mailing lists where software engineers sometimes come and say, hey guys, how should I implement this, or what does the standard mean? There's one called CRFG where a few of us are subscribed and try to help. But that formal body doesn't exist, and I think it would be a great thing to have. Yeah.
Okay. One last question. Okay, let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.